Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of the Physique Code podcast. Today we are lucky enough to have Dr. Mike Israetel on the show. For those of you that don't know Dr. Mike has a PhD in sports physiology and is the chief sports scientist at Renaissance Periodization. So a big welcome to you, Dr. Mike.
Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Now, today, we just want to do a brief chat about training programming and go through a few of the ideas that you usually run by with your training programs. So what I wanted to go through, first of all, was have you explain your theories behind the minimum effective volume, maximum recovery volume, and the MAV as well. So if I could just get you to run through exactly how those work, what those are, so people can have a better understanding.
Sure. So the minimum effective volume is probably the first volume landmark to talk about. And that's the smallest amount of training you have to do to see any noticeable gains in muscle size. As you can imagine, that's not the same for every person. It's not the same over levels of advancement. For example, when you start training, the amount of number of sets, for example, what you have to do to see any hypertrophy can be like 1 per week per body part. You do one set of hard squatting per week and another set next week, and you can see robust growth in beginners. When you're close to professional status as a bodybuilder, you can't hope to grow from 1 set of squats. If that was the case, I don't know why anyone would ever do 2. So your minimum effective volume is going to be higher as you get more advanced. Knowing that value is a real good thing, because if you don't know what your minimum effective volume is, you'd be making one of 2 mistakes. One, you could be always training way higher than it, and for some reason just training more than you have to, where you could get really good growth at low injury risk if you train closer to your minimum effective value, at least at the beginning of your progressions. And the other problem is if you're training less than your minimum effective volume, then the problem is you could just be training and spinning your wheels and not getting any muscle size. You're just doing enough to maintain, or somewhere in that really weird zone of higher than maintenance volume, but lower than minimum effective. And that zone, especially for advanced athletes, is actually quite large. So a lot of advanced athletes may need 15 sets to grow, but only 5 sets to maintain. And you can ask, so what happens if they train with 10 sets? Well, they accumulate more fatigue than they would if they train with 5 sets, but they still gain pretty much no muscle. So it's kind of really good to know your minimum effective volume. And then the other really pertinent volume landmark is maximum recoverable volume. So you could look at the research on hypertrophy training and see that more volume usually causes more growth. But that doesn't infinitely cause more growth. So for example, if you get more growth from 10 sets a week than you did from 8, should you do 12 sets a week? Should you do 14? Should you do 16? So on and so forth. Yes. But at some point, you're going to do so much work that your body's physical abilities to recover you are going to be completely taxed. They're going to be taken up. So maybe, let's say, as an example, 20 sets per week. For, let's say, quads, if you do any more than 20, your body physically can't recover. And because it can't recover, 2 bad things happen. One, at a physiological level, at a almost biochemical level, all of your energy resources are taken to recovery, and none of them really are left for actual muscle growth. So you end up just spinning your wheels if you train like that. And then the other problem is you're supposed to be progressing in reps you can do, the weight you can lift, and so on and so forth, in order to supply a continual overload through training, right? Training has to get harder. But if you're training at or above your maximum recoverable volume, your performance is actually deteriorating slowly. And if you deteriorate in performance, how are you supposed to supply your body with a big enough stimulus to actually grow? You say the last time your legs grew, you squatted 100 kilos for 5 sets of 10, and you've been ignoring your recovery signs and training with too much volume. Now you're only squatting, let's say, 90 kilos for sets of 10. Is that enough to grow you the most muscle? No, I think 102.5 for sets of 10 would grow you more muscle. 105 would, but 90 is not going to cut it anymore, certainly for optimal gains. So if we are going to train with more volumes, we are going to have to be wary and make sure we don't train over our maximum recoverable volume. So now that we have the minimum effective volume as the baseline for the lowest amount we should be training on a regular basis, our maximum recoverable volume is the peak, then we can say, somewhere in this golden zone is where all good training happens for muscle growth. There's other good reasons to believe that we should probably start towards this lower end at the beginning of a cycle and slowly ramp up, and then deload and drop fatigue and slowly repeat. But that's a smaller concern than just making sure you're somewhere in this zone.
Okay. And then, so then the middle gap is the maximum adaptive volume.
Well, maybe. So maximum adaptive volume is a bit of a curiosity. It's much more theoretical than the other constructs, which are much more easy to measure and conceptualize. Maximum adaptive volume is the theoretical maximum amount of volume at any one time that gets you your most hypertrophy. So the thing is, for example, if you are not used to lifting certain exercise or rep ranges, you actually need very little volume to get really, really good gains. And in addition to that, because you're not used to that exercise or rep range, if you do too much volume, especially at the beginning of a program, you quickly start to accrue much more damage, and thus your damage competes in recovery demand with your adaptations. So it's kind of overkill. So what is the optimal amount of training you can do? Well, let's say your minimum effective volume is roughly 10, your maximum recovery volume is roughly 20 sets per week. If you change exercises, change sets and reps and things like that, maybe somewhere close to 10 is your maximum adaptive volume in your first start in your first week, because that'll get you pretty sore and get you pretty beat up and get you a lot of growth. If you try to do 14 or 16 or 18, that might be just more and more damage and no more growth. So you start here, but then in the second week, your body's overload principle, adaptation, your body needs more, and it's also used to taking damage in exactly those types of ways. So now you probably need 12 sets, and then maybe 14, and then maybe 16, and then maybe 18, and when you reach 20, that's close to your maximum adaptive volume, but then it's close to your maximum recoverable as well. Time to deload and repeat the process. So the idea that we have here at Renaissance is that your maximum adaptive value is a good value to sort of think about theoretically, but probably it moves predictably over the course of your mesocycle from lower volumes to higher volumes. So our training approach is to start out at lower volumes, just above your minimum effective value, and then slowly titrate up to end at maximum recoverable around there, and then deload and repeat. And I think that attends to a couple of different things in training.
Okay, cool. And in terms of exercise selection that you're using, now once you sort of start hitting closer to that maximal recoverable volume, would you look at changing exercises, or would you look at increasing? How would you sort of progressively overload from that position when you're starting to hit the maximum recoverable volume?
Yeah, you don't. That's the answer. So when you've hit your maximum recoverable volume, you essentially have a huge amount of accumulated fatigue, because on the way to hitting maximum recoverable volume, you did more and more and more and more and more. And more stimulus, more stimulus, more stimulus gets you more and more growth, or at least the same amount of growth the entire time. But your fatigue starts to really skyrocket because fatigue accumulates over weeks and weeks of training. So now you're in a situation where you have a really high level of fatigue, and that fatigue impedes you from doing any more. It's almost, I think, a pretty good analogy that we use in some of our books is the analogy of a restaurant kitchen, where the stimulus of training is making actual good food that the customers get to eat. Fatigue is things like unwashed spoons, forks, knives, stains all over the place, slippery floors from oil spills, not enough food in the pantry to make proper food. So the question is, how do you overload when you hit your MRV? It's the same question analogically to the restaurant of how do you make good food, even better food than normal, if you've run out of pantry supplies, if the oil slicks on the floor, people are falling on it, if you don't have any clean spoons. The answer is you don't. You shut the restaurant down for the night, hopefully. You do a deep cleaning, you reorder supplies to arrive in the morning, and then once you're back to square one and everything's clean and restocked, then you go ahead and you start to make good food again. So just the same way, what you do after you hit your maximum recoverable volume usually is some kind of fatigue management, usually a deload, where for a week you train much less, especially less volume, but also probably less intensity. You eat and sleep super well. You recover so that your fatigue levels drop really low, and to open up another productive walk all the way from your minimum effective volume to maximum recoverable. And you say, well, how do you start back at your minimum effective volume? Well, after a week of deloading, you're a little bit detrained, right? So the minimum effective volume probably goes up over your normal weeks because your body gets used to stuff. After a week of deloading, it falls actually pretty considerably. And because you're stronger after that whole mesocycle, you use heavier weights, which means every set you do is heavier, which means it causes a little bit more fatigue than you'd expect. So even though maybe you used to have a 10-set MEV, now you have a 12-set MEV if you were just as strong. Because you're stronger, your 12-set might go down to 10-set again, and you might be at 10 sets. Now, of course, over months and years, it goes 11, 12, 13, 14, and eventually goes up really high, your MEV, and eventually so high that you can't recover anymore and you're retired. But it goes up very slowly. So most cycles, cycle to cycle, you drop pretty close to the same level of training that you were at, pretty close to your minimum effective volume. Depends on some other variables, exercises you choose, so on and so forth, and then you start the slow climb back up.
Okay, well, that makes sense then. Going back to the minimum, the MEV. Now, we spoke briefly yesterday about auto-regulation and determining your MEV. And I think that was a super important part to go over. So I just kind of want to run over that again really quickly on the 3 ways to measure what you think your MEV is with the pump and your exertion. And would you be able to just expand onto that a little bit more?
Sure, absolutely. So we have kind of like a really neat, quick and dirty method to measure or estimate your minimum effective volume. And here it is. You go into the gym and you do a certain amount of training volume. It's per session measurement. But if you want your week, then you just add up all your sessions and there's your weekly MEV. So per session, you go in and let's say you're training biceps and you want to know what your minimum effective volume is for biceps. Well, you're going to monitor 3 factors. One is the degree to which you're experiencing a pump, right? The muscle pump or cell swelling is actually a direct mechanism for hypertrophy, but also correlates with the degree of disruption and damage caused to muscles, which also correlates to hypertrophy. So if you go and you train, you don't get any pump whatsoever, gee, I don't know, you might not have stimulated any growth. There's other ways to stimulate growth we'll get to in a second, but if you don't have any pump whatsoever, that's not a good sign. So if you're looking for MEV, at least somewhat of a minimal pump to say, okay, I'm feeling something. The next one would be effort perception. Generally speaking, almost by definition, muscles grow when they're challenged. If they're not challenged whatsoever, they're probably not going to grow. Another way to think about this is, if you could grow muscle without feeling remotely challenged, wouldn't that be amazing? You would have found a training program that doesn't challenge you at all and grows muscle. You could just do it forever, never get hurt, never accumulate fatigue, and just get jacked. It doesn't work like that. Most of the time, when you're minimally effective in the gym, you're also minimally experiencing some discomfort and some tension in your muscles and a feeling after the workout is over, like, ooh, okay, I felt something happened. It was disruptive. So at the very bottom end of that, like if you walk out of the gym and you say, dude, that was a warm-up, it's probably not minimum effective volume just yet. If you walk out of the gym and you're like, I could have done way more, but I felt something, maybe it's minimum effective volume. And then lastly is soreness. Right? Soreness can be measured right after the workout as far as like tightness and maybe weakness of the muscle. And the soreness can be measured in delayed onset fashion, which like a day or 2 days later, your muscles are still sore. Minimum effective volume correlates probably to some kind of soreness. So for example, if you train your biceps and you walk out of the gym and someone's like, so what muscle did you train? And you're like, I don't remember. And someone's like, well, can you like move your muscles around and see which one's kind of tight or fatigued or sore? And you do it and you're like, I don't know, they all feel great. Yeah, you probably didn't hit minimum effective volume, right? If somebody bonked you on the head after you trained biceps and they woke you up and they're like, what did you just train? You're like, hold up. Ooh, I don't know, something, oof, this feels kind of rough, you know, and it doesn't have to be delayed onset sore, but even just tight or a little tense is a good sign that you did some kind of damage, some kind of disruption, and you probably did something. So minimum effective volume is if you got some kind of a pump, even a minimal is fine, if you perceived some kind of disruptive effort, like it took some work, and if you got some kind of soreness, even just tightness the day of, some kind of weakness, then you probably hit minimum effective volume. Even 2 out of 3 of those is a good sign. But if it's 0 out of 3 or just 1 out of 3, you probably need to do more work, right? So if you want to know what your minimum effective volume is, there are ways to calculate it more formally, which we get into in some of our books, but we can certainly get into it in a seminar. But just the short, sort of quick and dirty method is one that works pretty well. So someone can ask you, hey, like, what's your minimum effective volume for biceps? And sort of taking all those 3 into consideration, you could be like, it's like 5 sets, right, per session. And they'd be like, so what happens at 4 sets? And you're like, well, like 4 sets, like I don't get a reliable pump. It doesn't really feel like a lot of work, like barely any. And to be honest, I don't feel anything after. It feels like I haven't done anything. Minimum effective volume of 5 sets means like 5 sets it gets me to a pump. It's definitely some work. I feel like I've done something. And also it's one of those situations where afterwards I'm like a little tight, like definitely lose some energy in my biceps. So I think I did some stimulation. So once you know that, that's the way to calculate it. You can basically design a program for yourself that starts an MEV by going to the gym and experimenting, right? Another really cool fact is you can do this on the fly without taking a soreness into consideration. So just on effort perception and just on pump, you can get to a really good guess at your MEV in the actual session. What do I mean by this? So it's nice that after you get soreness and 2 days later, you can reevaluate that whole process in your mind and be like, okay, I guess 5 sets was my MEV for biceps, but maybe you did 6 sets and it was overkill because you got really sore, or you did 3 sets and at the time it felt like enough, but you never got sore at all or even disrupted. So you're like, I guess it's more, I don't know what it is. You need another week to retry. Here's a better approach. During actual bicep training, you track the degree to which you're getting a pump because you can tell right away, and then you track the degree of effort perception. So basically, how do you start at rough guess for MEV? You show up to the gym, you start training a body part. As soon as you get a minimal pump, like a little pump going on, right, and you're starting to feel like, okay, I'm starting to put in work, stop. That's your minimum effective volume. And then next week, you can go up from there and up from there and up from there and up from there on forward towards your MRV.